For months, the music world buzzed with a rumor so electric that industry insiders couldn't stop whispering about it. The greatest voice of the 1960s and the greatest voice of the 1990s. One stage, one song, the 1994 Academy Awards. Producers at the Academy called it the most anticipated musical moment in Oscar history. The rehearsals were scheduled. The arrangement was written. The costume consultations had already begun. And then, 3 weeks before the ceremony, it was over. The official statement said scheduling conflicts. The real reason was something nobody in Hollywood was willing to say out loud. Not then, not for 30 years. What actually happened inside that rehearsal room on a Tuesday afternoon in February 1994 was witnessed by only 4 people. And what Barbra Streisand did, and what Whitney Houston refused to do, revealed something about both women that the music industry had been carefully hiding for years. But the most important part of this story, the part that will stay with you long after you've finished reading, isn't about a performance that never happened. It's about a handwritten note, a private act of humility, and a friendship that was born in silence behind one of the most famous stages in the world. It started, as so many legendary moments do, with a phone call that nobody expected. It was November 1993, and Whitney Houston was at the absolute peak of her powers. The Bodyguard soundtrack had sold over 40 million copies worldwide. I Will Always Love You had spent 14 consecutive weeks at #1. She had just won Grammy Awards, American Music Awards, and Billboard Music Awards in a single year. Everywhere you looked, there was Whitney, her voice, her face, her undeniable presence dominating every corner of American culture. She was 30 years old, fearless in her gift, and she was about to receive the phone call that would define the most complicated months of her professional life. The call came from David Goldenson, one of the senior producers organizing the 66th Academy Awards ceremony. He had a proposal, and he wanted to deliver it personally. What if, he said carefully, the show opened with a duet? Not just any duet, the 2 greatest female voices in the history of American music, sharing one microphone on the biggest stage in the world. Whitney Houston and Barbra Streisand. The room went quiet. Whitney's manager at the time, Nicole Avery, who was present for the call, later said she had never seen Whitney Houston rendered speechless before that moment. She just sat there holding the phone, and for about 10 seconds she didn't say anything at all. The admiration Whitney had for Barbra Streisand ran deeper than most people understood. Growing up in Newark, New Jersey, in the house of gospel royalty Cissy Houston, young Whitney had absorbed music from every direction. Gospel from the church, soul from her mother's voice, pop from the radio. But Barbra Streisand occupied a category all her own. Here was a woman who had refused to be limited by genre, by era, by anyone's expectations of what she should sound like. Here was a voice that seemed to exist outside of time itself. Whitney had told interviewers as far back as 1986 that Barbra represented a standard she aspired to, not to sound like her, but to last the way she lasted, to matter the way she mattered. And now the phone was offering her the chance to stand beside that woman on the Oscar stage, and she said yes before the end of the call. But you haven't heard the most important detail yet, the one that changed everything. Because what seemed on the surface like the beginning of a dream collaboration was, beneath the surface, already carrying the weight of something far more complicated. 2 women, 2 legacies, 2 completely different understandings of what it meant to protect a voice that the world had decided belonged to everyone. Barbra Streisand's first response was not what anyone expected. When Goldenson's team reached out to her camp with the proposal, the initial answer was not an enthusiastic yes. It was a question. One question, delivered through her management with careful, deliberate politeness. What song? The selection of the song, they made clear, would determine everything. It needed to serve both voices equally. It needed to be iconic without belonging to either of them. And it needed to sit in a key that would allow each woman to operate in her most powerful range without compromising the other. After 2 weeks of negotiations, the team settled on a newly arranged version of Somewhere, the classic from West Side Story, a song that had been recorded by both artists individually at different points in their careers. The arrangement would be written specifically for this performance by legendary composer Marvin Hamlisch. It would begin with Barbra on the opening verse, transition to Whitney for the second, and then bring them together in a final climactic passage that, according to everyone who heard the early demos, promised to be one of the most extraordinary vocal moments in television history. Rehearsals were booked for 3 dates in February 1994. The world had no idea what was coming, and then, on the second day of rehearsals, everything fell apart. The 4 people in that room on February 8, 1994, were Whitney Houston, Barbra Streisand, the arranger Marvin Hamlisch, and a sound engineer named Gary Pressler, who has never spoken publicly about what he witnessed. The first hour had gone remarkably well by all accounts. Both women had been professional, warm with each other, genuinely excited by what the arrangement was bringing out in their voices. Hamlisch later told a close colleague that hearing those 2 voices fill the same room had made the hair on his arms stand up. But then, somewhere around the middle of the second run-through, the session moved from acoustic rehearsal into a technical sound check. And that's when the conversation began that would end everything. The production team had prepared what they called a vocal enhancement track, an industry-standard practice for live television performances of this complexity. The idea was simple enough on paper. Both voices would be lightly processed through a harmonic blending system that would soften the tonal differences between them, creating a smoother, more unified sound when they sang together. It was subtle, they assured both women. Most viewers would never consciously notice it. And here is the thing that nobody talks about when they tell you this story, the detail that reveals everything about who Whitney Houston really was when the cameras weren't rolling. Barbra Streisand said yes, and Whitney Houston said no. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. People who imagined a screaming argument between 2 divas would be disappointed by the reality, which was quieter and, in its own way, far more powerful. Whitney listened to the full explanation of the process, asked a few technical questions that surprised everyone in the room with their specificity, and then said very calmly that she understood what they were proposing, but that she wouldn't be doing that. Her voice didn't need blending, she explained, not because she thought it was better than anyone else's voice, but because she believed that altering it, even slightly, even technically, would be a betrayal of something she couldn't fully articulate, but felt completely certain about. She had spent her entire life learning to trust what her voice did naturally, in church basements and studio booths and stadiums, in every room where she had ever stood with a microphone. She was not going to stop now, not for the Oscars, not for anyone. What happened next is the part of this story that breaks your heart a little, even if you understand exactly why it unfolded the way it did. Barbra Streisand did not argue. She did not push back. She sat very still for a moment, and then she said something that nobody in the room had expected. She said she needed to think. She excused herself politely, walked out of the rehearsal space, and didn't come back that afternoon. 3 days later, through her management, came the official withdrawal. Scheduling conflicts. The statement was exactly 4 sentences long and said absolutely nothing. The 1994 Academy Awards would move forward without the duet. A solo performance would be rearranged. The world would never know what it had almost received. Whitney Houston found out about the withdrawal during a flight from Los Angeles to New York. Her assistant handed her the fax on the plane, and Whitney read it twice, folded it in half, and then placed it in her bag without saying a word. The woman sitting beside her on that flight later said she could see something shift in Whitney's face. Not anger, not disappointment exactly. Something harder to name. Something that looked, from the outside, like the expression of a woman who had just confirmed something she already suspected about the price of refusing to compromise. For 3 weeks, she said nothing publicly. She focused on her solo performance, rediscovering the material, rebuilding the emotional architecture of what the show would now require her to do alone. The people around her during those weeks described her as unusually quiet, unusually internal. She would sit at the piano in her dressing room for long stretches without playing anything, just thinking. Her vocal coach, Patricia Kenner, who worked with Whitney throughout the 1990s, later said she had never seen her prepare for a performance with such fierce, almost ferocious concentration. It was like she was preparing to prove something, Kenner recalled, not to the audience, to herself. The night of the 1994 Academy Awards, March 21st, at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion in Los Angeles, Whitney Houston was scheduled to perform approximately 40 minutes into the broadcast. She stood in the wings, alone, exactly the way she had stood in the wings since she was a teenager, singing in the New Hope Baptist Church. Her dress was gold. Her hair was pulled back. The stage lights threw long shadows across the floor, and somewhere out in that auditorium, 3,000 people sat in their seats, none of them knowing what she was carrying into this performance with her. And there is one more thing you need to know before we get to what happened on that stage. Because what happened in the wings, 90 seconds before Whitney walked out, is a detail that only one person ever confirmed publicly, and she did so only once in a 2019 interview with a small music journal that almost nobody read. Standing in the wings on the opposite side of the stage, watching from the darkness, was Barbra Streisand. She had come to the ceremony as a presenter. She had not told anyone she would be watching from the wings. She had simply arranged it quietly through channels she did not explain, and she was there. Whitney stepped out onto the stage and the audience responded with immediate, enormous warmth. She smiled the way she always smiled, the full, unhesitating smile that made you feel like she was singing directly to you, regardless of where you were sitting. The opening notes of her performance filled the auditorium, and within the first 30 seconds it was clear that something was different about this performance. Not different in a technical sense. Different in the way that a fire is different when there is wind behind it. She wasn't just singing. She was doing something more deliberate, more committed, more raw than a polished television performance was supposed to be. She was giving the auditorium every single thing she had, without a filter, without processing, without a single layer of protection between her voice and the 3,000 people listening to it. The sound was enormous. It was also, in the truest sense of the word, completely human. In the wings on the other side of the stage, Barbra Streisand stood completely still and watched. The performance lasted 5 minutes and 40 seconds. When it ended, the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion gave Whitney Houston the kind of standing ovation that is not about appreciation so much as acknowledgement. It is the sound an audience makes when they have just witnessed something they did not expect. Something that reminded them why live music exists in the first place. Something that no recording could have fully prepared them for. Whitney stood at the microphone, slightly breathless, and accepted it with the same full, unhesitating smile. And then she walked off the stage. She was in her dressing room 40 minutes later when there was a knock at the door. Her assistant opened it. There was nobody there, just an envelope on the floor of the hallway, placed there by someone who had not waited to see it received. Whitney's name was written on the front in handwriting she did not immediately recognize. She opened it. Inside was a single sheet of notepaper, cream-colored, with no letterhead, and 6 sentences written in blue ink. The note has never been photographed. The full text has never been published. But Whitney shared its existence with 2 people in her life, and one of them, her longtime friend and confidant Robin Crawford, confirmed in interviews after Whitney's death that the note existed and that Whitney kept it, that she had it with her for years, that it was among the personal items found in her suite at the Beverly Hilton in February 2012. What Robin Crawford said about the note's contents, in her own careful, guarded language, was this. She said it was an apology. She said it acknowledged that a mistake had been made. She said it contained a sentence that Whitney had quoted to her more than once over the years, a sentence about voice and truth that Barbra Streisand had written in blue ink on a cream notepad and left on the floor of a hallway without waiting to see it received. "You were right," Crawford said. Whitney had told her, the note said, "Your voice should never be touched." Whitney Houston framed that note and placed it in her dressing room. Every tour, every performance, every television appearance she made in the years that followed, it traveled with her in a small wooden frame and was positioned on her dressing table before she went on. Her vocal coach saw it hundreds of times. Her backup singers saw it. Her stylists and assistants and managers saw it and understood without being told that it was not to be moved or commented upon. It was simply there, the way a compass is simply there, pointing towards something that doesn't require explanation. The friendship that began in those weeks, if you could call it a friendship, which was perhaps too ordinary a word for what it actually was conducted almost entirely in private. There were no photographs, no joint interviews, no public acknowledgments. Occasionally, at industry events, the two women would find themselves in the same room, and people who were present at those moments have described a quality of recognition between them that was different from the ordinary mutual admiration of famous artists. Like they shared something that didn't need to be spoken about, said one such witness. Like they had already had the important conversation. What Whitney Houston did on the 1994 Oscar stage was not simply a great performance. It was a declaration. It was a statement made in the only language she fully trusted about the nature of a gift and the responsibility that comes with it. She had been offered the most prestigious stage in the world on the condition that she alter her voice, even slightly, even technically, and she had walked away from the offer rather than accept the condition. Not out of vanity, not out of stubbornness, out of something closer to faith, the same faith that had shaped her voice in the New Hope Baptist Church in Newark, New Jersey, the faith that what she had been given was already exactly what it was supposed to be. 30 years later, people still talk about that Oscar performance. They talk about the standing ovation, the gold dress, the extraordinary sound of her voice filling that auditorium without anything between it and the air. What they don't know, most of them, is what it cost her to walk onto that stage alone. What they don't know is the cream notepad and the blue ink. What they don't know is the woman standing in the wings on the other side of the stage, completely still, watching. But now you know. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear what it sounds like when a woman refuses to let the world make her voice smaller. Because that sound, the real, unprocessed, unblended, uncompromised sound of Whitney Houston choosing her truth over her career, is still reverberating. Some sounds don't stop. They just keep moving outward long after the singer has left the stage.